Good morning. Grab your chairs, folks, because I'm going to rock your world. When Melissa first started talking, I thought, oh, we got the same presentation. And I thought, well, okay, she keeps going. It's all good because we'll all talk about the same things. We are obsessed with low speed limits in work zones. Is that the right thing to do? If you start looking at data and you start looking at information, you start working with contractors, you find that there's a huge difference from what traffic folks want to do and what the contracting industry wants to do. Let me ask you a question. Is the world round or flat? Because I ask that question of our industry folks all the time. And they say, well, it's round. And it goes, okay, we've got our first step, and we're going to move forward. So I'm going to talk to you about speed management. And the law enforcement gentleman, been around 30 years. There's a lot of history in speed limits. It's been around a long time. And I had a very smart traffic engineer that I worked for several years ago who, in fact, taught me how to build work zones without speed limit signs and get what you wanted. We're obsessed with posting signs. We want enforcement. I had one project where you talked about writing buckets of tickets. We had one enforcement community wrote 6,000 tickets in 2 months. Speeds didn't change. That's not the answer. Let's talk about some things. I'm going to give you a little history. How many remember the energy law in 1974? There was an Arab oil embargo. We didn't have gas. We had to buy some East Coast. You were buying gas every other day because you had odd even days. And guess what? We reduced the speed limits to conserve energy, 55 miles an hour. It was a national thing. We actually, in fact, wrote into our own vehicle code requiring at that time that work zone speed limits would be 45 miles an hour. 10 mile an hour reduction. Does that sound familiar? Well, 1974, so we're down to 55 and we're posting work zones at 45. We had a blanket speed limit reduction. In 1988, the rule changed. We were allowed in states to raise our own speed limits on our interstates back to 65 or even 70 miles an hour. A couple states, I think, don't even have speed limits. All right? But we had a huge variation here because when the speed limits went up, no one bothered to look at work zones and say, wait, should we keep with the 10 mile an hour reduction? No, the work zone stayed at 45 in Michigan. We started getting a huge variation in speeds. And part of it was because everybody was obsessed with the low speeds. How many have heard marketing? Slow speeds save lives. You heard that? Slower speeds save lives. We hear that all the time. Well, here we are. We've got this huge change now. We've got this huge speed differential, and we're asking motors to reduce their speed a tremendous amount of miles per hour versus just 10. In 1996, we did a little national cooperative research project. Report number 192 said, in fact, speed limit should only be reduced 10 miles an hour. Okay, I go along with that. And it was adopted by AASHTO, and it was recommended for use in all states. It also supported the language in the MUTCD. So again, here comes the trends back. We should only reduce 10, but now we're going to go, instead of from 55 to 45, we're going to go from 70 to 60. Well, in the report, it showed compliance. And part of the report shows, in fact, that once you've gone past 10 mile an hour reduction, the motorist basically has a really difficult time at trying to reduce their speed down to those numbers that you really want. So if somebody wants a 25 mile an hour reduction in speed limits, they were actually only getting between 9 and 11. That's not very good. That's you want 25 and you're not getting it. The motorist says, I don't understand. At a 10 mile an hour reduction, look, you're not getting 10, but you're getting closer to that than anywhere else. So it's kind of interesting when you start looking at what they did in their research. And they looked at speed variance, which from a safety standpoint, for a motorist who's driving down the road, speed variance is a huge crash contributor, right? You got somebody driving faster and somebody not driving so fast, you get your rear end crashes out because you got this huge speed differential. Look at the percentage of increase in speed variance as the higher reduction in speeds go. We're asking motorists to slow down more and more and more, and the speed variance keeps going up higher and higher and higher, which means we're actually, in our reduction of speeds, are actually contributing to crashes. Now, any contractor that I've ever talked to said, we just want our work zone safe. We don't want crashes. We don't want people being struck. We don't want any of our people being hurt. I can live with that. and so can they. But when you start talking to them about speed variance and trying to get people to drive a realistic speed limit, they all agree that they want low speeds. They want the speeds low enough so the driver can go by and thank them for their work zone. It's only about 20% of this, but anyway, I can't really show you that. Okay. So in 2005, as I'm getting involved in my project as the work zone administrator, I started making attempts to reestablish the existing speed limit guidelines back to a 10-mile-an-hour reduction, which is also the requirement in the MUTCD. The laborers groups went off their deep end. They went to the governor's office, they got it all stopped, and in fact, the governor's office said for the remainder of the 2005 season, all work zones will be posted 45 miles an hour. Now, picture yourself driving on a rural freeway in a project that's 14 miles long, and the whole project is posted 45, and workers are working in a spot about as big as this room. How many think people drove 45? Not very many. There was road rage. We had passing on shoulders. We had cars passing other cars in the work area to get around the barrels and then drive back in, because what we had was about 5% of our traveling public were trying to drive 45. Well, that means 95% of the public didn't get it. It was very, very frustrating. What we did in 2006, we negotiated with industry to go back to a 10-mile-an-hour reduction. We could do additional reductions, but only if they had gone through an approval process through our engineering offices and our downtown management offices. We also agreed to post where workers present 45 signing through the projects that only require the motorists to reduce their speed in the proximity of workers. In other words, we've got a 10-mile-long work zone and we're working in an area as big as this room. The only place the motorists would have to drive 45 is in the area the size of this room. The rest of the project drive 60. In fact, honestly, from an enforcement standpoint, if it may be posted 60, but we don't really care about what the motorist is doing as long as they're not by the workers. Let them go. Let them drive. We started doing some speed data collections. And in 2008, obviously, we have data that shows higher speeds than posting when posting is inappropriate. Well, we've talked about that too. If you post bad, you're trying to get something that the motorist doesn't understand, they don't perceive it, they will not slow down. And part of it is where our contractors will leave the where workers present 45 signing up after they, for example, place barrier wall. When they're placing barrier wall, we like the sign the workers are in very close proximity to traffic. We're placing barrier wall, we use the sign there, and then they won't take it down. Once the workers are behind barrier wall, folks, we take down the where workers present signing and let the motorist drive 60 miles an hour or whatever it is they're driving. We just let them go because of the positive separation. So I want to show you some rough data here, because what's really important in the data is we concentrated on where the workers were. We concentrated on proximity. This is where the work zone is posted 45 where workers present and 60 miles an hour, and we have workers on the site. Okay? Well, we have all lanes open, which means the shoulder closure, the motorist doesn't understand 45. You got workers present, they're on the shoulder, but there's no lanes closed, and the motorist goes, I don't understand. There is some speed reduction. You talked about the 85th, Melissa talked about the 85th being, 78 or so. It's about 78, 79 in Michigan, so there's some comparisons there. So we were getting some, but not as much as we should. In fact, if you look at the 62 to 66 miles an hour, and the reason I have range here is because no two jobs are alike, so it's very hard to capture identical data. So you have to kind of put it all into some parameters here. But if you have one lane open and one lane closed, the speed limits came down closer to that 60, closer to 60. But again, 45 workers present, still not in play here. They're still driving about 11 miles an hour over. What really gets interesting is when you start looking at the proximity of the worker. You get the worker within 10 feet of the open traffic lane, and the motorist habits change. So here we are, less than 10 feet away, and look at the speed samples down in the 45, 46 miles an hour range. That's what we got our signs posted for. Wow, it works. But only if you ask the voters to do what they think is reasonable. And that's really the ticket. All right, let me show you some more. So here's this job. We're doing a longitudinal joint, and this will become an HMA overlay. And by the way, one thing that's very important from an enforcement standpoint, I got to tell you this because we built a 6-minute training video for our enforcement community. The enforcement community has been trained, and we did this for a reason. You see where I took this photo? When we do enforcement, our enforcement is where the workers are located. It's nowhere else in the project, unless there's somebody being really silly. We were doing some speed surveys. We did get one gentleman at 103. He was being a little silly, and we, in fact, had him stopped. But what we did in the video and what we talked about with the enforcement community is there's two types of enforcement, right? There's active and there's passive. Active means I'm writing tickets. Passive means I'm just visible, and I'm not really doing anything other than just there. Well, what we wanted the officers to do when they're doing either type of enforcement is position themselves right about in here where I'm shooting, where we're taking the photo from. And the reason for that is when we have the signing that says where workers present, there was always a concern about how do you properly enforce that and get a court to hold the ticket up. Where's the does the enforcement come 1,000 feet from where the workers are? Is it 500 feet? What's the magical number? And we said to avoid any gray areas, enforcement has to come where the car is directly adjacent to the workers. That's black and white. The motorist is speeding. They're adjacent to the worker. That's a ticket. So we taught the officers to position themselves downstream from where the workers are located. We did that for a reason. Now when a motorist is driving through the work zone and they see workers, what is the potential anticipation? When they see a worker, they may also see an officer. They may not be there. The idea is that we're slowly training the public to understand this. When they come upon an area where there's active work present, there could be an officer sitting on the back side of that, watching vehicle speeds. By the way, what do you think the average speed of the vehicles are in this operation right here? 26. Actually, we started posting this sign, we actually had speed limits vehicle speeds go way down below what we posted. Actually, we worked too well. And our state police actually talked to us about this. It's like, wow, we never anticipated that people would drive that far out of the box. Now here also, by the way, this is one of those work zones where I wouldn't necessarily have posted it when I was a young worker, because my traffic engineer said you take a motorist out of their comfort range by pushing them partway out of the shoulder and narrowing up the lane so there's no shoulder next to them, and they're very close proximity to the workers. The vehicles will slow down all by themselves. You don't need to post signs out there. All right, now I take the same work zones and I take the workers away for the day, so the closure's there, or in this case, all lanes are open, so there might be a shoulder closure, and the workers look 65 to 71 miles an hour, and one lane open, one lane closed. Our speeds are running between 56 and 67 miles an hour. Speed limits are posted 60. The where workers present signs are still up, folks. The motorists are very interesting. When we first started posting the where workers present 45, and we're watching motorists as they're driving into the work area, they get by the workers and you see the brake lights go on and the nose of the car come down, and we're watching how these motorists are overreacting, and we're going, oh my, what have we done here? We're going to have rear end crashes like crazy. And speed limits are directly related to crash conditions in work zones. I'm going to show you that too, even so you get a little teaser for tomorrow if you come and talk about crashes in work zones. What really kind of messes up the data, though, is when the contractor has to do ingress-egress. They have, in fact, we had an anticipated operating speed of 60 miles an hour on a project last year. The contractor's operations, however, were operating at around 40 miles an hour. So instead of having a 6-minute delay, we had a 6-mile backup. When we talk about our mobility policy and posting appropriate speed limits, we have to be concerned with how the contractor gets in and out of the job site, because those speed differentials, while it does create a data change and says, wow, look, we've got speed limit compliance, it's an artificial compliance caused by interference. And let's face it, we have to get to the job site. but we have to find safer ways to get in and out, which is why I'm also here, because the ingress-egress conference piece is going to be very interesting, trying to deal with how we do this. This is a real classic example of how speed limits can be affected in a work zone, where a contractor's operation requires them to slow down to cross over into the work zone. You can see the backup going up around the curve there behind the bridge. The operating speeds here will take, on this particular site, took between 18 and 20 minutes to resume a normal free flow after the truck turned out. That's a very long slowdown, and so it's hard to get speed data when you have these type of things going on. We're in this position here to do speed data, and we can't because of the interference that's going on. So we're working on limiting the amounts of locations to enter and exit traffic. We're creating tapers for acceleration and deceleration if we can. We want innovative ways to access the work site so we can maintain that traffic flow. It's very, very important. And that's important because of the speed limits and wanting to get the motorists through the work zone. That's the important thing, okay? We've got this mobility policy that says don't delay, don't create, and that if we don't do some of these things, it impacts speed limits. And speed limits impact crashes. Is there a relationship, do you think, let me ask you this question, do you think there's a relationship between posted speed limits and crashes in work zones? You bet there are. Show you some data here. In 2005, we were required to post everything at 45 miles an hour. In 2006, we went to the where workers present 45. Look at what happened in our truck line. We dropped 1,000 crashes in one season. Folks, that's significant. Okay, we're not talking a couple of crashes here and there. That's 1,000. Now, in 2007, the numbers went back up a little bit because of our mobility policy requiring us to put people in different positions, and speed really wasn't in play here. And our 2008 data, of course, is going to be somewhat depressed because the gas prices were up and things like that, but we're still going to have another very nice reduction. This was why somebody thought I should get a Governor's Traffic Safety Advisory Council award, is because we had a 20% reduction in crashes. This was pretty significant. But the crashes in work zones, speed differential, your side swipe and rear ends, the people who are driving too fast and somebody else isn't driving fast enough, create side swipe and rear end crashes. Speed differential, traffic volumes that are at or above capacity, contractor ingress, egress, contractor interference. The speed differential is probably the highest one. 50% of our crashes are rear ends. That's speed differential crashes. So here's our rear end crashes. Again, we had some nice reductions from the old 45 where workers present down to 2006 here. We dropped a very nice number of crashes and rear ends. We don't have very many fatalities in Michigan of motorists, which is very nice, but still it's too many. But you can see the numbers keep trending down because we're working on things about mobility and letting the motorists drive through the work zone. Side swipe, same, again, a few smaller numbers, but the numbers are still coming down. And we had a little spike in 07 because of some lane width issues, and we're trying to correct that. But again, with posting the appropriate speed limits, we keep trending our data down, which is very, very good for us. So, very quickly, we have to work on motorist compliance. The motorist has to understand what the rules are. And by the way, we do get complaints about the where workers present 45. A lot of people go, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. If the workers are behind tarping for bridge painting, they don't know if they're supposed to drive 45 or not. We've had officers that will write citations where the workers are up on top of the bridge structure and they're not in close proximity, and those tickets get thrown out. So we keep working on this issue. And there is, by the way, a couple of our customers are working on some legislation to impose the flashing light signing where it flashes and says this is what your speed limit is when flashing. And we actually tried that in Michigan several years ago, and we couldn't get somebody to turn it on. We couldn't get them to turn it off. We couldn't get them to move it. So it was always, for us, very appropriately placed. and caused us problems, which is why we went to a passive signing. We said we're working present 45. That's what our contracting industry wanted. They said we want something that's easy for us. We don't have to move around. We don't have to change. We post that sign in advance of our work zone to advise in advance of the first work area so that the motorist understands what the rules are before they get to the workers. And then that's posted through the work zone at every interchange, and we do that, or no more than 2 miles apart, and we post it in conjunction with a 60. It actually worked pretty well for us, and we're pretty happy with it. So, at this point, I would entertain some questions if you have any. Oh, here we go.
During that time period, did Michigan DOT undertake any public outreach in regard to work zones as far as trying to raise the awareness of the public?
We talk about work zone speed limits usually several times a year, beginning with our work zone kickoff. We talk about especially the emphasis on where workers present 45. There's usually several newspaper articles a year that also discuss that, but no real direct public outreach was done other than we sprung the signs on the public just to see what would happen. I will tell you this, prior to doing that, we had collected some speed data, and I think I mentioned earlier that only about 5% of our people were complying with 45. We did some post-data collection after we posted where workers present 45 and the 60-mile-an-hour combination, and our compliance was 80%. That's, when I say compliance, I talk about compliance, and you saw the number up here where the motorist still isn't driving 45 in a lot of the scenarios. The compliance actually brought when I talk about compliance, we got considerably closer to what the rules were, where enforcement then was in a better position to look at that 85th percentile and work on those 15% of the motorists who were driving so far out of the box they stood up where they could be enforced properly. You had a 45 posted, who do you stop? 95 out of 100 vehicles are speeding. I might pull somebody over for driving 60 in a 45. In the meantime, 35 or 40 other vehicles are driving 75 miles an hour. I could have stopped them too. By changing the posting, our enforcement improved because we put people into that range where they could be noticed. Now, the contracting industry, how many of you work next to the barrels? Okay. So when you're working next to the barrel line, traffic generally looks like they're driving pretty fast, don't they? You bet they do. How fast are they driving? Do you know? Nope, they just look like they're driving pretty fast. We actually go into our work zones, and we will stand next to the workers, kind of hidden, so the motors can't pick us off. We use LiDAR so that we don't buzz off the people's radar detectors. We'll say to the gentleman, pick your victim, and they'll go, well, I want this guy right here. He's flying, and you go, beep, 54, and he goes, 54? He's got to be doing 80. And the problem that we struggle with our industry folks is when you're standing on the barrel line every day, and I've done it myself. I know. I came from the dirt. You don't get a feel for how fast people are driving. I will tell you this: it's very easy now to pick out the ones that are driving out of the box, and those are the ones we like to have. We do, by the way, occasionally dress up officers in work zone gear, and that's how we got the guy at 103. So.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with, I mean, well, I guess the question, I don't really care how you get people to slow down, whether it's through your metrics or changing the configuration of the work zone or whether you have signs at all. I just feel like, we don't want people driving more than 45 if they're close to the barrels and workers are present. I mean, I know if I were standing there, that barrel is not going to protect you. So, 45, you may have a chance of getting out of their way if there's a warning sign or an intrusion alarm or something else that's gonna alert you. If people are traveling 60 or 70 through a work zone, you don't have a chance. So I think we have a similar goal, which is how do you achieve it? And I guess what I'm hearing you say is, well, as long as workers are present, people will slow down. Therefore, you don't have to do anything else. And I'm not convinced of that. I don't want our guys being warning signs that to get people to slow down. I mean, if you want to post DOT folks in the work zone to get the drivers to slow down, as a warning sign, yeah, that's great. Or maybe we could post, holographic images of workers or something to school people. I know in, I think it was Arizona, a guy came up with this idea where he had like life-size, figures of workers that he posted in work zones, and people did slow down. So maybe that's the way to go. But I don't want our guys being the signs, basically, to get people to slow down. And if the signs don't work, we need to think of other innovative ways to do it. If you want to get people to slow down, there are ways to do it, obviously. You could even put up a traffic light and just say, okay, stop, you're not going to go anywhere. Or you have a truck you have to follow through the work zone. I mean, there's lots of ways to get people to slow down if we really want to. But I think we can do it responsibly and get people to travel in a without so many rear end crashes. I mean, you can use rumble strips. There's lots of ways to slow people down. But I don't want our guys being signs.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a question, because you posed an interesting comment about you believe that you're safe at 45 and you have the ability to evade. The difference between 45 and 60 miles an hour is 0.3 of a second. Your ability to react to a motorist who is entered into your work zone, that 0.3 of a second, may, on occasion, make a difference if the motorist is far enough away, because you're talking about 88 feet per second at 60 miles an hour. Okay, that means the motorist has to go off the road far enough in advance for you to evade. If he does it right next to your barrel line, you're still dead. The other thing I want you to realize, and I can't tell you my source because I did read it. It was a while ago. It was very interesting on a survival rate of a person being struck by a vehicle. What do you think your chances of survival being struck by a vehicle is traveling 40 miles an hour? What's the percentage? It's 20%. So the unfortunate thing about the 45 miles an hour is the reality is people and our contractors, I've talked to contractors countlessly about this, is the fact that you think 45 is safe. I walk into a work zone and I walk up and say, how do you feel out here? He said, I feel comfortable. I'm going to drag you out of the work zone, and I'm going to tell you you should never feel comfortable in that work zone. I don't care what the speed limit is.
So what is the safe speed?
What is a safe speed?
To go through the work zone.
Detour is a safe speed.
Right. I agree with you.
Okay.
That's why our position is as much as possible, people should be behind positive barriers, or they should close the road. That's it.
Now, let me also give you some statistics on workers in Michigan. How many workers die by motorists in Michigan every year? How many do you think? 20? 1? That's our average. 1. We didn't have any in 08. In fact, in the last 6 years, the motorists who died, or the motorists who killed workers, the workers were all standing in open lanes of traffic where they don't belong. And that's the issue. That's what I'm trying to convince our industry of is, folks, if the motorist is just driving by you, who cares? What we worry about is when the motorist doesn't drive by, or they end up in the work zone. Most of our intrusions in work zones in Michigan, intentional intrusions. I'm driving through the barrel line because traffic's backed up. I'm going to try to sneak around and cut a few cars off. They're trying to get to an interchange. They don't know where exactly to go through the barrel line at. I don't know if I feel fortunate about that or not. I also want you to understand is that I will not put anyone at risk if I think it's wrong. But the reality is when you have motorists driving through at speeds of 65 miles an hour, and they've been doing it for years, and you're trying to post it at 45, and nobody's getting hurt, the reality is that the speed limit sign doesn't mean anything to the road user. It doesn't mean anything. We don't care. And they think it's okay to drive by. We think it's okay for them to drive by too. And that's the there has to be a good balance. There has to be a balance of making sure, and this is my number one goal in Michigan, is that if you're all working for me in Michigan right here, whether you're DOT or state, county, city, contractor employees, you all have to go home at the end of the day. And that means the motorists too. And that's my number one goal. If somebody dies in work zone, I take it personally. And unfortunately, one worker death on average by a motorist. You go inside the barrel line, 30 a year die in general construction. I'm more concerned about what happens inside the barrel line. And the motorists, we have an average of 18 per year die in work zones. So most of those, in fact, 50% of those are rear end crashes, speed differential crashes. Trucks don't stop, plow into the vehicle in front of them and kill people. We're trying to find ways to move traffic.
Okay.
I drive a 40-foot motorhome also. In generally, I don't fly, I travel on the street. And what I'm saying is anecdotal based on my observations. But 99% of the time, I heartily agree, people will slow in an area where workers are present. Not only will they slow, but sometimes will endure the shoulder rumble strips for several miles just to move over to give that extra cushion. What I think needs to be done, there needs to be more attention on leading up to the entering the work zone area, better signage, better lighting. You also have to pay attention to the downstream chaos when traffic builds up, like we saw with that truck going into the work zone. I looked in my mirrors, and I can tell what's going on 30 miles down the road from me. So I'm aware of it because I've got electronic equipment that I can keep track. But I'm looking in my mirrors and I'm seeing cars coming up. I see white smoke coming out of their tires. I've got my flashers on. I've got a flag out, doing anything I can do to slow traffic down. But they don't have the equipment that I have in my motor coach to tell me what's going on up in front. So there has to be, I like the idea of these mobile message boards saying that there might be chaos or there might be delays down the way. But I hardly agree, and we'll discuss this after the session, that I think you're certainly on the right track.
You need to come to tomorrow's session on work zone crash reduction strategies.
All right. Thank you.
That's a little teaser, by the way, because there is between speed limits and crashes, there is a relationship, and as well as other things like you talked to. So I'm going to tease you and say, folks, tomorrow there's a session on crash reduction strategies and work zones, and there's some pretty good stuff in there. We've had some excellent successes in crash reductions because obviously if we reduce crashes and traffic just drives by, that's the perfect work zone, and that's obviously a goal.
I agree with Brian to some extent that we shouldn't be using workers as signs out there, and unfortunately very often you don't know where the workers are until you're right on them and you don't really have an opportunity to slow down. But there are lots of good techniques that are being used, a number of agencies use, such as using larger channelizing devices, decreasing the spacing on the channelizing devices, additional supplemental signing, and a number of techniques that are used in quite a few states that really tip a driver off to where they're coming into the active. But I'm going to use a term we don't hear used very often around here, the workspace, which is what we're really talking about, not the work zone. Remember, the work zone starts at the back end of the queue and goes all the way to the end roadwork sign. So we're really talking about the workspace, the active workspace is where we want to be concerned. That's where the workers and equipment are. That's where we want the drivers to be slowing down. And there are lots of techniques, as I mentioned, decreasing channelizing device spacing, increasing the sizes of them. When I travel through some states and their typical channelizing is cones at 120 or 160 foot spacing, it doesn't do much to get a driver to pay more attention and slow down. But when you start using drums out there at a 20-foot spacing, just that extra confinement, the feeling that the driver gets going past that is going to have a big effect. And I think it does help to slow down. So those kinds of techniques, I think, in conjunction with the more significantly reduced speed limits where the workers are present, I think it's the best approach and it's going to have the biggest overall approach.
I agree. And some of the concerns, obviously, you have when you increase the number of devices that you have on your job is that you also expose a worker to maintaining those, especially if they're placed in closer proximity to the traffic lane. I have a couple of students that come and work for me during the summers, and last year, for example, I had them pull and review every crash report that occurred in a work zone in 2007, so we could actually look at cause and effect. And the striking a traffic control device where there's actual crash reports on it are relatively low. But we also work very hard at trying to give the motorists a reasonable traffic lane, and we also talk about worker proximity. And I'll just give you an example. Mobility policy, which everybody has to abide by, We established a no more than 10-minute delay driving through work zone, additional delay to what you would already have. And what comes into play is we're doing. We have a review team that looks at all of these projects of significance to determine whether these requirements have been met. And one of the things that we really have taken a hard look at is constructability. Where is the worker? How big a lane can you give the motorist? How much will it cost if we actually close the road or close and shift all the traffic to the other side, and so the contractor can work without traffic next to them? And can we expedite the work schedule, pay a little bit more money, and actually reduce the work, not only the worker exposure, but reduce the motorist exposure to being close to the construction area? And so we look at cost and time. And a prime example is we were concerned about trying to maintain two 10.5-foot lanes on a freeway, which I don't really care for. That would have placed the workers literally with their butts in the barrel line. I don't like that either because that's too close. And so we chose to close and detour the road and cut the construction in half, build a better project, reduce the exposure, and give the road back to the motorists in a more timely fashion. And you get rid of those exposures. Those are really important balances when you're working in mobility policy, because you may divert traffic and you still deal with the speed issues, but the safety issue has to come in play.
This question is for either one of you. Has there been any research or work done that looks at lateral separation from the workspace versus speed in the work zone? For example, we've developed a table where you have concrete rail, we're not going to reduce the speed. If you have cones or barrels, 0 to 6 feet, we're going to reduce it. 6 feet to 12 feet, we're going to reduce it. We're wrestling with the values that need to go into that table, and we're still making adjustments. So I'm really curious as to if there's been any detailed research that you know of elsewhere in the country on that relationship.
Some of that is in 192.
I think a piece of it is in 192, the Grand
They
Nicholas.
don't have to look at the segments of spacing, but I know they looked at one closed lane, which was like shoulder work. But I don't know if he got it down to if you're 0 to 6, 6 to 12, that kind of a categorization. We did in this. If I can get you a copy of the report, we did look at similar stuff like RAM. We looked at shoulder work operations, which basically they were, could be on the shoulder. We looked at operations. Our shoulder can be up to 12 foot wide, so that'd be like a 0 to 12 kind of from the travel lane. And then we looked at off roadway operations, and we looked at enclosed lane. So we did look at some of that. We did specifically say if you're X to Y spacing this, but we kind of left it as lane closure, active people on foot, shoulder work active, and just active off the roadway. So we still kind of left it in general locations. We did not get as specific as that. Do you have anything like that?
Well, there is a little bit of a relationship between construction and competitive bidding. It's kind of an interesting thing that has a little side effect on what you're asking for. And we've developed some typical cross sections for lifestyle cost analysis. And the reason for that is you get into the competitive bidding between concrete and asphalt. And the asphalt folks like to work right on the barrel line. You've seen all the operations where they're raking their materials out, and the rake goes out into the traffic lane, and they'll bid that job because they can bid in a smaller work environment, and they're willing to expose the workers to traffic, which drives me crazy. But then the concrete folks, they have to have more room because they have to run string lines and their pavers, and they need more room. So what we built is some lifestyle cost LCCA typicals that require specific offsets that are the same for both bidders, which is, of course, driving the competition crazy because now we're trying to level out the playing surface. And it positions the workers 4 feet from the barrel line on all those types of projects. Now, I don't know where they came up with that number, okay, but I think it was more based on the concrete folks than the asphalt folks. And we have some edge drop criteria that has specific issues about how far away you have to be before you treat it we're considering adopting that also for what we do when we have workers exposed, and it has to be how long the exposure is in place. If the workers are on that barrel line all the time, all day, we're considering barrier wall usage because we think the positive separation is not only important, but the positive separation not only provides potentially better safety environment, but you can allow the motors to drive faster. I think that's a good balance. But our industry folks say we don't want to use more concrete barrier wall. So here's the contractor who talks to us and says, we want to be safe, but we don't want more barrier wall. It's you hear this and then you hear this. It's two different stories. We would like a straight story from them because we're not afraid to pay for safety. I mean, our director said, if people want safety, let's pay for it, let's do it, let's provide what they need. And then you go and say, let's put more barrier wall. And go, no, I don't get it.
Who were you with by chance?
State of Idaho Transportation Department.
You could do through the listserv. You could probably do inquiry. You get lots of responses
From different states.
in different states.
The grant stuff has, if it has payment, it's dropped off between X and Y. Some of that's in there, but not. I think we're looking more for a detailed table. I think or categorization.
They're going to be developed. I don't think there's any question about that because with mobility requirements, we're taking more and more space away from the ability to work and giving it to the traffic. Somebody has to develop something.
We've actually developed it and implemented it, and our feedback has been fairly mixed. So we're now just trying to come into where we think those appropriate values should be.
Actually, I'd like to see it, get with you and get the information. Like
So would I.
The listserv is a good place to kind of survey other states and other people as well.
Great.
You mentioned taking drivers out of their comfort zone. In that one slide you showed where you pushed them on the shoulder, and it looked like there was a vehicle that maybe helped push them onto the shoulder. Could have created a visual obstruction for them upstream. Have you thought about that or used that as one potential way to slow people down if they can't see what's coming? And that may
Well,
slow down.
we had talked about, there had been discussions about, maybe we should put up some screening so motorists can't. I mean, how many have you driven through a work zone and the work has been really close and everybody slows down and kind of look and see what people are doing, Had that happen? And we talked about, well, maybe we could put up some screening so the motorists can't see and maybe that'll, but I'm going, well, wait a minute, what about the workers on the other side of the screen? If a vehicle goes errant, you won't see it. So we kind of nixed that idea. And quite honestly, I want the motorists to see where they're going. It's important that they have a clear travel path and can see very clearly where they're going. Now, in that slide that I had, the equipment was actually kind of encroaching the barrel line or the cone line. I would have rather pushed those cones out a little bit farther yet if we could. But obviously, when you have limited amount of shoulder or curb, you can't always push the traffic as far away as you'd like. And that really does come into play. But we caught some of our maintenance workers doing a bridge deck coating, and they had the cone line right on the skip, and they had their butt literally was in the traffic lane, and there was a 10-foot paved shoulder on this bridge deck. We're going, what are you doing? And we walked out, and we took a few minutes, and we moved the cones 3 feet out into that traffic lane, pushing traffic onto the shoulder. The speeds came down 15 miles an hour, and the workers were 3 feet away from traffic. Much better environment. And we always encourage our folks to do that wherever they can. Obviously, if we have more than one lane open, we have to think about where is the traffic going to go. I don't like encroachment. The MTCD allows a 10-foot lane, and you can encroach into the lane. We don't do that. When we have any kind of encroachment in the lane, we take the lane away because I'd rather give the workers more room to work. Okay, and that's really important. Yes, there's going to be compromises on vehicle speeds. Yes, there could be some backups and delays, and there may be some crash increases, but that safety to work on site is also very important. Okay, there has to be, and don't get me wrong, all my customers get treated fairly. I can't let it swing one way or the other. People who are on foot are not in a car, and they're not protected as well as somebody that's in a car. So I always will lean a bit more towards the worker if I have to and take more away from the traffic. There has to be a good balance.
Sorry, one last quick question. Sure. I'm Russ Holt from Rhode Island DOT. You made a note about enforcement placement in the zone, and I've seen conflicting, or I've seen other guidance on where police might be if it's a presence mode. And you did highlight both presence or active enforcement. Can you clarify, does Michigan have that practice where if you have police, they're at where the workers are, not between the second and third event signs?
Okay. Good, great question. First of all, we have an agreement with our enforcement communities. It started out with just the Michigan State Police, and now it's with all of our communities. And we have about $750,000 that we have earmarked for enforcement in work zones. It's overtime enforcement. We actually pay for them to be on the site. And we work through our transportation service centers in Michigan to determine when they need to be on that site and what we would like them to do. So it's really up to our project, our resident engineers to say we need active enforcement. They might get the request through the contractor who says we think things are out of hand out here. We need some active enforcement. Other times they'll say on the project site, hey, we're not doing any stage changes today. We've got some people in proximity, but it's not too bad. Can you just sit out here? So the presence, we allow them to set wherever they want. However, if they sit at the beginning of the work zone, most motorists feel there won't be another officer. So occasionally we will wolf pack those where we'll have one officer sitting at the beginning and then motorist speeds go back up, and then there's some active enforcement later. But we encourage them during active enforcement to be in the proximity of that worker. Now, there isn't anything that prevents an officer, by the way, when I talked earlier about where there's no workers and it's posted 60, that we don't care what the motorist drives. It's officer's discretion, and it always has been and always will be, whether they decide they're going to stop and cite the motorist or warn them. So in areas where it's posted 60 and there's no workers, if they feel that the motorist is driving out of the box, they do have the ability to enforce whenever they want. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. By the way, if you go to the Michigan.gov website and go to click on the Michigan State Police web page, you can find that 6-minute enforcement training video. Some of our people who have gotten citations have actually used that video to get out of their ticket, and also some of them have also found that they saw the video and they couldn't get out of their ticket. We're very open about the use of that video because the officer may have made a bad decision or may not have used it appropriately. We do, in fact, then go and talk to those enforcement communities. We've also had the unfortunate meetings with some of the magistrates who throw all of the tickets out because they don't think it's posted appropriately, and you have to go meet with those folks too. So it's an ongoing thing. It's we've only been doing this since 2006, and we're still collecting data, but we think we're much more closer to a realistic speed limit than where we've ever been. Now, ideally, what would be the best way to set speed limits in a work zone? You set your work zone up, and then you go out and you do a speed survey, and you post it for what the motorist is driving, or obviously if they're driving 78, I can't post 75 or 80 miles an hour, but you post it appropriate to what the motorist sees, what the conditions are, and it should change. Of course, when you say that to our Michigan State Police folks, that our traffic folks there say, "Well, you're talking, that's just crazy talk because that's what you should do." And how do you do that? It doesn't work that well. Okay.